Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to pattern a tail just like this. This tail is a 3D piece, and what I mean by 3D is that it has 3 pieces to it. So it has 2 sides, and then it has a gusset, which is an extra piece added for width running right down the middle of it. If you're new to patterning, patterning a tail is a really good way to start. Generally the shapes are pretty easy. Even adding a gusset to it, the shape tends to be just a simple triangle. So if you want to learn how to pattern plushies, this is a good place to start. Let's get started. So in this case, I'm going to have 2 sides, which is going to be this shape here, but then I'm going to add a gusset to it, which is going to be a third pattern piece that runs along the bottom of this tail. And the purpose of the gusset is to give this shape width. If I didn't add a gusset, this tail would be very narrow, and this is meant to be a dinosaur tail. And if you think about a T-Rex, for example, it's going to have a width to the tail that something like a cat wouldn't have, for example. So if you were to pattern a cat tail or a lion tail, something very thin, you wouldn't necessarily need a gusset. If you think about how a tail is, it's just kind of thin. So if you just split it into 2 parts, then you don't need to run a gusset along the middle. But if you think about the shape of any triangular tail, how you have this width here, if you only had 2 pieces, you're not going to be able to get this width. It would end up being very narrow in the middle, something like this. So you have to add a third piece to your pattern to be able to get that width. So I like to start by patterning the sides of a tail that needs a gusset. My client provided a shape for the tail, and that's what I'm going to follow to start patterning it. If I didn't have this, I would draw it myself to scale with the plush that I'm making, and this is printed out to scale. And again, I'm going to recommend, if you can afford a printer, it will make plush making a lot easier. So since my client drew on how she wanted the tail to look, I just went ahead and resized the image to scale with my plush and printed it out, and now I can make my pattern directly from this image here. If I didn't have that, I would have to draw it myself, and might be a little bit more time consuming. But I'm going to go ahead and start by tracing the shape here without seam allowance. So I'm just going to trace along this line here. And this is the point to which, if you had any parts of the piece you're trying to make that aren't plush friendly, that you'd want to go ahead and edit here. So for example, I'm looking at this line here, and if I were to continue this line, I think it would curve in an awkward way. So I'm going to actually make it a bit wider than is indicated here. Another example would be if your piece is too small, either if it's too thin and would be impractical to sew. For example, if it'd be impossible to turn right side out, or if it's too detailed, you might need to sacrifice some detail here. So I have my general shape from the side that I'm going to want now, and I have to think about how it's going to connect to the body. So this is actually the arm of my plush in this image right here. So it's going to have to come out a little bit farther than that, and I know that just from being familiar with what I'm working on. But in general, you're going to want to add more space here to where the tail meets the body. because either way you decide to attach this, you're gonna need some room here. If you decide to hand sew on your tail, you're gonna want to have a little bit more than just your seam allowance, I would say, for your tail, to just make it easier to hand sew on. I use a particular method to machine sew it to my plushies, and for that method I like to have a lot of extra fabric the first time around, which I plan on making a video for that, but I just know that I want extra fabric here than I'm going to end up having in my final piece. So I'm going to go out farther here than I will actually need, and then I'm going to connect these lines. So generally you're going to want your tail where it meets the plush to be rounded like this. And this doesn't have to be perfect because, again, however you decide to attach your plush, you're going to be getting rid of some of this space here anyway. And I also know just from experience that where the tail meets the body at the top and the bottom, it's going to be more narrow here at the top. So you can see how I didn't draw it out here. I decided to curve it in a little bit. So that's why I've drawn this shape like that. So this is my overall tail shape here. Might even it up here at the bottom. Now I have to add seam allowance. So seam allowance, I use a 1/4 inch. Some people don't add seam allowance to their patterns, and that's perfectly fine. I add seam allowance to my patterns just because that's what I'm used to. I do a 1/4 inch because that's about equal to the distance from the edge of my sewing foot and where the needle lands in the middle, so that way I don't have to do any other difficult measurements while I'm sewing. I just line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of my sewing foot. I'm just gonna eyeball it, so I'm just going to draw in my 1/4 inch seam allowance now. Now this tail tip is pretty nice and wide, so I'm not too worried about getting a point here or having any difficulty turning it right side out. The one thing I'm gonna do from experience is just kind of even out this tip here to where it lays more flat. So you can see here how this tip kind of curls upward. I'm going to go ahead and flatten that out because I know how where the gusset ends here, it's going to need to be flattened a bit, this angle. And then I'll just add some here just for the heck of it. Doesn't hurt to add more where you know you're going to cut down, but you don't want it to be too short and then you'll have to remake it again. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and cut this piece out. Make sure you're using crappy scissors that you don't use on fabric. Okay, so I have my side piece here, and now what I need to do is to pattern the gusset. And again, the gusset is the pattern piece that is going to add width to this tail. If you think about how a dinosaur tail is shaped, it's a triangle. So my gusset is going to be shaped like a triangle. It's going to be pretty simple shape. If you're new to patterning plushies, tails are a good way to learn how to pattern gussets, which is one of the most difficult things to do. Generally, tail gussets are going to be simple shapes, unlike some of the gussets for a head or a body. It's often going to be something very simple like this, some kind of triangle or a long strip. So if you're new to pattern making, tail is a really good place to start. So I have my piece here, and the first thing I'm going to do is measure how long the side is where the gusset's going to attach to. And the gusset's generally going to be always on the bottom of your tail, just because you want less seams on the side where it's going to be seen from. And since this character is a dinosaur, she's going to have spikes along the top of her tail that I wouldn't want a gusset to be there, since I'm going to sew the spikes directly into this seam up here. So my piece is pretty much exactly 11 inches long, so that's how long I'm going to want my gusset to be. So I have a piece of paper here. I'm going to fold it hot dog style, and then I'm going to mark 11 inches along the fold. And you want to fold it just so that your pattern is perfectly even and that you're not having to do any guesswork. So there's 11 inches. I'm going to open it back up, and then I'm going to just lightly draw along the middle here just so I can more easily see where the middle is. So now you need to decide how wide your gusset needs to be. Again, this is a dinosaur tail, so I want it to be this shape. So if this is the top of the gusset, then it's going to be wider up here, and it's going to be ending in a triangle down here. So I know it's going to end in a triangle here. I'm going to make sure that I leave some seam allowance here, because my 11 inches included seam allowance, but if you don't include seam allowance on your patterns, then obviously you don't need to make sure you have seam allowance room here. But now the question is, okay, how wide do I need to make it up here? And generally what I'll do is measure directly onto the plush. So I've got my test plush here, and you can see I've already got a hole cut out to where the tail is generally going to go, but this isn't exact. This is just a hole I cut out, and I know it's probably going to be about this size or probably a little bigger. So I'm just going to measure how wide I want it to be, and probably about 3.5 inches wide. So with seam allowance, I'm just going to make it 4 inches. And this is kind of where, when you're patterning plushies, it's a trial and error process. So I might go through here and make a 4-inch wide gusset up here, and then decide either that's too thin and I need to make it bigger. In that case, I have to come back here and widen the pattern, cut out another piece, and sew it up again. If I decide that it's going to be smaller, that's better, because I can just make the piece smaller and I don't have to cut out any more fabric. So generally you want to err on the side of making things larger than they should be. So I'm going to make mine about 4 inches, maybe just a little wider to be safe. So I'm just going to fold this again, and then use my measuring tape to measure about, I'll do 2 and 1/8, just to be safe. So I'm just going to mark that here. And for the shape up top, just from experience, I know that it's going to be a convex shape like this. So I'm just gonna lightly draw in a convex shape. And another thing is that I made this line 11 inches, but this isn't the line that you're gonna be lining up with this seam. It's actually gonna be this line that you're gonna draw right now. But I like to draw the 11 inches or the length as your middle part, just so you can get an idea of how long your piece is going to be, just to have something to start with. So like I just said, my piece in total is going to be 11 inches, so I'm going to put the 11-inch mark down here where my seam allowance ends, and then line it up here with my 4-inch mark. And now I'm just gonna trace here, just get a general shape. Now I'm gonna just sketch out the shape more. So shape-wise, I do more curved outward. For gussets, sometimes you'll need a convex shape if it gets a little too wide or bumpy, but just from experience, I know it's going to be an outward-facing curve like this. Okay, so let me just double-check this measurement here because I went a little wide. It's pretty close. So I'm at about 11 and a quarter. I'm actually going to leave it, again, because it's longer than I think I need. It doesn't hurt for it to be longer. It's just a little extra wiggle room, and I can cut down on the piece when I need to. So now I'm just going to fold this up and cut it out. So you can see here that I go below the 11-inch mark here at the top, but I'm gonna curve it up to be the 11 inches up there. All right, now you have a gusset. So pretty simple once you get the hang of it. This was a pretty easy shape to make, and it's a great way to start. So now you need to think about which way your minky or your pile needs to run, since it's a tail, and fur on tails generally runs towards the tip. I'm going to draw an arrow marking that this is the way that the fur needs to run, and same with this. So now I can cut this out, sew it together, and see that it looks all right. Let's do that. Okay, so I've gone ahead and cut out my side piece. I've sewn the seam along the top of the tail. I've used a wider stitch than I would if this wasn't a practice piece, just because I'm going to seam rip this later. So I don't want to do any more work than I have to. I did want to show you guys one tip for cutting out the gusset. Gussets tend to twist because you're usually using minky or fleece or some kind of stretchy fabric to make plushies, and because gussets are long and narrow, sometimes they can be cut in a way where the fabric is going to twist when you sew it together. So if you had a tail, it could be a little lopsided. Even if you sewed it perfectly, the fabric will twist in a way that is not intended, and that's just due to the way the gusset is cut out of the fabric. So To prevent that, you can fold the fabric and make sure that your fold here is perfectly even and clean and has no wrinkles to it. And then you're going to fold your gusset and line it up exactly with the edge. And then just go ahead and trace it and cut it out like you would any other pattern piece. And you'll want to use the same kind of fabric for your test pieces that you're going to have for your final plush, because fabrics are all different from each other. So if you decided to use a fleece instead of a minky and your final plush is going to be a minky, it's going to come out different because fleece stretches differently than minky. Even this plush here, I usually use Shannon minky, but this is a different type of minky. We like the color for this character, and Shannon doesn't have a color like this, so I'm using a minky I found at my local fabric store. I don't even know what brand it is, but I bought it all, and I'm going to be really sad when I run out of it. Alright, so now I'm going to cut this out. And this way also you're going to make sure that your gusset is perfectly even. Alright. So now I've got my gusset. So what I'm going to do now is pin the gusset to the tail and make sure that it lines up the way I want it to. Everything getting in my way. All right. So I'm at the end here. You can see this is a little bit long. Not much, but if you remember, when I measured, I was at 11 1/4, and this is just about exactly a 1/4 inch too long. And at the top here, I just made sure that there was enough sticking out to where the seam allowance is gonna catch right here. And so it looks like I'm just gonna need to shorten this just a little bit, which is gonna be pretty easy fix. I'm just gonna take out those last few pins. I'm gonna fold my fabric. And I'm gonna cut off a 1/4 inch. And then I'm also going to just trim up the width here, because I want this to end in a triangle, so if I didn't thin it out there, then it wouldn't come to a point, perfect point. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and sew this seam, and then I'm gonna do the same to the opposite side. Okay, so I've gone ahead and sewn the gusset onto the other two sides of the tail, stuffed it to double check that I like it, and I like it a lot. The gusset is nice and even. It's not twisting at all. I like the width of this tail. The shape is pretty much exactly how I wanted it to be. It looks nice and clean. Looks like a good width for the plush. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this onto the plush and double check that the proportions are how I want it to be and finish up. Alright, so I've gone ahead and pinned the test tail onto my test plushie. I think it looks pretty good. The shape of it still looks really nice on the plush. I have a suspicion that it might be a little too big, but I'm gonna run that by my client. If it was solely your decision, obviously you can adjust the tail any way you need to from here. If you needed to make it smaller, you could just go ahead and do that on your test tail. If you need to make it bigger, unfortunately you'll have to start over by cutting out more fabric. If you need to make any shape changes, then likely you're going to have to start over as well. But pretty happy with this first run. So we'll see if any changes are warranted. If you were to go ahead and hand sew this on, then you didn't need to do anything more for the pattern. You can see that we allowed for enough extra fabric at the tail here to where there's plenty of fabric here to go ahead and hand sew this on. None of these edges are raw. They're all folded over to where they can just be a nice clean seam. But I personally am gonna machine sew the tail on, and I'll cover that process in a different video since it's a whole other beast. But I think it looks pretty good. Yeah, hope you learned something today. If you guys make anything with the tutorial, I'd love to see it. And thanks for watching. Bye-bye.